Hello, you fine internet folks. Now, I'd like to get this out of the way first. I am recovering from the flu, so my voice is a bit raspy, and I do apologize for that. And if you hear me sniffle or take a sip of coffee, it's to help with my throat. But we're not here to talk about me being sick. What we are here to talk about is this, AMD's RDNA4 architecture. Now, AMD is launching the RDNA4 architecture found first in the RX 9070 series of cards. This is the 9070 non-XT, and the 9070 XT I have over here on the test bench. Both of these cards were sent over by AMD for review. Big thank you to them. But yeah, let's just get into it. So, RDNA4, this specific die, I believe, is called Navi 48, or that's what the rumor mill or whoever coined the term is calling it. This is Navi 48. And the Navi 48 die is fabricated on TSMC's N4P node. This die is 357 square millimeters with 53.9 billion transistors on it, which gives you a rough transistor count of about 150 million transistors per square millimeter, which for TSMC's N4 is actually really good density. Each of these dies has up to 64 compute units, 64 Ray accelerators, 120 AI accelerators. That 64 compute units gets you 4096 stream processors, which can clock up to, in the stock configuration, 2.97 gigahertz, excuse me. Now, my editor will hopefully put in the screenshot of the XT running at 3.9 gigahertz. This was achieved in VK peak. Now, it was during the FP64 test, which isn't the most compute intensive. However, I do have another screenshot of this GPU achieving 3.7 gigahertz in the FP16 scalar tests, which are more computationally expensive, just because it's doing a lot more of them. So these cards are really interesting to overclock, let me put it that way. And I really do wonder how they will behave under LN2. I wonder if we may see, well, we're probably going to see a 4 gigahertz GPU. I wonder if we're going to see a 5 gigahertz GPU. So yeah, that's quite interesting. Now, those 4096 stream processors each can do 256 operations of FP32, excuse me, which gets you a total throughput of FP32 vector of just over 48 teraflops, 48.7 to be exact. And because of packing for FP16, these can get up to 97.3 teraflops of FP16 vector support. And the reason why I'm emphasizing vector is because these cards are capable of matrix operations, just like their CDNA data center counterparts. The matrix throughput of FP16 for this card is approximately 190 teraflops of FP16. I'm not positive what the accumulator is. I don't know if that's 190 FP16 teraflops with an FP32 accumulator or an FP16 accumulator. So not 100% positive on that. But what's also new with these matrix cores is that they support the the FP8 data type, as well as what AMD is calling the BF8 data type, which is a different rearrangement of the mantissa and exponent values in an FP8 data type. FP8 is traditionally E4 or exponent 4 mantissa 3. BF8 is exponent 5 mantissa 2. So they're supporting both standards of FP8, which is good. These matrix cores also are capable of int16, int8, and int4, as well as 2 to 4 sparsity, though sparsity is not used a ton, so your mileage may vary on that. These cards are equipped with 64 megabytes of infinity cache, so that's 16 megabytes per 64-bit memory controller, because these cards are equipped with a 256-bit GDDR6 memory interface with 16 gigs of GDDR6 that is running at 20 gigabits per second, which gives you a total memory bandwidth of 640 gigabytes per second. And the PCIe interface is Gen 5, and there's 16 lanes of it out to the CPU. The stock power for the 9070 XT is 304 watts, and the stock power of the 9070 is 220 watts. Now, we'll come back to that, but there is some interesting behaviors with the XT, with the 9070 non-XT when you bring it down to the 150 watt range. Some very interesting characteristics that we'll cover in a little bit. But let's talk a little bit more about the Navi 48 die. Now, like I said, there is 64 megabytes of infinity cache, which in front of it is 8 megabytes of L2. Now, previously in prior generations, AMD has had 1 meg of L2 per 64-bit of memory controller. That has now been doubled to 2 megabytes per 64-bit memory controller. And once you dive into the CU, you'll see that each CU is equipped with 32K kilobytes of L0, and 2 of these compute units are tied together in a WGP. Now, what's interesting is that in prior generations, 2 WGPs were, or work group processors, were tied together in a shader array, which had a L1 of either, in RDNA1 and 2 was 128 kilobytes, and in RDNA3 is 256 kilobytes. What is interesting is that it appears that that L1 is no longer a cache level. It does appear that it still exists. It appears as if it's 128 kilobytes in RDNA4, but I believe, and if you look at the LVM memory map for RDNA4, it's essentially, it's calling it an L1 buffer. What I suspect the L1 now is essentially a write coalescing buffer. And that makes sense because the original intent of the L1 was to, one, was to reduce the number of requests that the L2 had to serve, as well as reduce the number of wires that AMD had to lay out from the L2 to each compute unit. Essentially, you can aggregate 4 of those wires into 1 wire by wiring up 4 CUs to 1 L2 and then 1 L2 to your L2. So that's what I suspect this L1 is now essentially is. In terms of what's new with the compute engine, there's been RAID trace improvements. So the RAID accelerator has been improved We'll talk more about that in a second. However, what hasn't really seen much improvement is the dual issuing capability. So your mileage may vary on if you can get the full teraflops out of this GPU using the dual issuing capabilities that it does have. That would require a lot of reuse of operands, and so, like I said, your mileage may vary. Something that has seen some updates is to their schedulers, specifically to barriers. They now have split and named barriers, though I did ask about these, and I got a very odd response of there are no named barriers despite them being very clearly in the presentation. So regardless, what these barriers allow these new barriers allow AMD to do is, if you have one part of a workload finish, you don't have to halt on that being finished and wait for everything else in that work group to process. You can start essentially a new operation. And I think that's where we're going to start first. And this is sort of the biggest architectural change. This is really interesting to me. And that is the out of order memory accesses. So the best way I can describe this is, if you guys know the Cortex A55 core from ARM, it's an in-order core. However, it can do memory operations out of order. Now, traditionally, an in-order core has to proceed as it gets instructions and cannot, well, reorder them. I believe that this is the first time we've seen out of order capabilities on a GPU. What this is allowing is memory instructions within a warp, well, a wave. Wave, warp, same terminology, same thing. Essentially a wave of instructions. If you ever hear wave 32 or wave 64 with regards to AMD GPUs, that's essentially issuing instructions, 32 instructions or 64 instructions all at the same time. A warp is wave 32, but that's just NVIDIA's name for it. So what this capability allows AMD to do is it allows memory instructions to complete out of program order, which is really interesting for a GPU. Now, AMD says that ray tracing workloads are highly sensitive to latency, and that is true. And this significantly helps with latency, because if you can imagine, as the diagram shows here, it essentially allows a wave that has a lot more cache residency to proceed faster than a wave that doesn't. Let's say wave X here has a lot of L0 accesses versus wave Y having a lot of memory accesses. If you have to wait for wave Y to complete certain accesses, then you're going to be stalling on wave X for a long period of time, when if you didn't have to wait for wave Y, you could proceed a lot quicker. So this is very interesting to see. And yeah, latency requests will very much be, latency behaviors on RDNA4 will definitely be improved. But it's not just for ray tracing. I could see applications such as compute also benefiting from this. If you have a workload that's not very cache resident versus a very cache resident workload being issued to the same compute unit, yeah, if you can access memory out of order, that would be a significant help. And speaking, since AMD highlights ray tracing, let's talk about the improvements to the ray tracing architecture. The ray tracing architecture here in RDNA4 has been significantly improved with BVH8, as well as a doubling of the ray box and ray triangle throughputs, so that it can now do 8 ray boxes and 8 ray triangles per ray accelerator. And this, yeah, that is the majority of where the RT improvements AMD is saying are coming from, is from the increased throughput of the ray box and ray triangle units. Now, AMD has this, what's interesting here is the pack and sort diagram here. That was not previously found on older RDNA cards. Now, this is not like NVIDIA's shader execution reordering, or SER. That allows you to reorder threads so that threads that hit or miss and threads that go to the same location. So let's say if multiple threads all go to memory instead of to L1 or L2, they end up in waves together. What this allows the ray accelerator to do is store results out of order without messing the ordering up. That's what the sorting is for, is that it allows the hardware to keep track of what order everything was issued in, and then it can preserve the same order when essentially executing it to the program. So that the program still thinks everything's in order, but within hardware, it's being dealt with at a out of order level, essentially. What this allows is it allows the RA to skip ahead and process faster rays and wait for slower ones that need to access memory to go out and access memory and come back. Again, very similar to what we saw with the out of order memory stuff. So yeah, what's interesting here is that AMD is not talking about having a BVH walker, which if you remember Imagination's levels of RT, where IDA and Blackwell and I believe also Intel fall into like level 3 or level 3.5. Technically, I believe RDNA4 still falls into level 2, just like RDNA3 and RDNA2. However, the RT capabilities on RDNA4 have significantly improved, which does kind of show that those levels are not a be-all and end-all. So, yeah. Now, one last thing I would like to talk about in terms of the architecture is AMD now allows what they're calling dynamic registers. So this allows allocations of registers to be more dynamic. Essentially, what a shader has the option to do is request extra registers from a pool, and then once the work is done, release those shaders back into the pool of registers. Essentially what this is allowing is it allows waves that need more registers to access more registers, as well as allowing more waves in flight. So more parallelism, more processing of data all at the same time, which is what GPUs are all about in the end. So this is quite an interesting improvement. I believe that on Blackwell, NVIDIA also has behavior similar to this. Though that may also predate all the way back to Hopper, which, again, this would be interesting in a compute architect, in a more like a CDNA4 or what the rumor, or what I believe Jack Hyun from AMD referred to as UDNA. So maybe we'll see this in a future compute architecture. Now, that's sort of the highlights to me about the architecture of RDNA4. Now we'll move on to the performance, and we'll have some graphs here of the ray tracing and the raster performance in probably mostly in 3D Mark, though I may do some further Cyberpunk 2077 testing. And well, other sites, if you want more in-depth testing, other folks will have that. But what I would like to highlight is the behavior of the 9070 at 150 or 154 watts. Let's call it 150 just to make the saying it easier. It's about a 15%, about 15% performance reduction over the stock 220 watts. But frankly, I actually really like the performance at 150-ish watts. It's quite a capable GPU, especially if you don't need to run 4K or if you don't need to run everything at max settings. I would like to see almost a 9070 LP edition where it's, if you guys remember the RX Nano from the Vega generation, sort of a nano version of this card for small form factor builds. I think this card would actually do really, really well in that form factor. So hopefully somebody makes that. But yeah, all in all, for this launch, as long as, now let's talk about the bugbear here. The bugbear is ROCm. When is it not? And I believe on a previous tech poutine, I was talking with Ian and I said, they need to have day one ROCm support. Well, officially, there is no ROCm support for these cards, for RDNA4. So yeah, however, we have been able to get ROCm to run pretty easily, actually. And we do have some performance numbers in comparison to a 4090, which is a completely different class of GPU, but that's what I have data on. And it's about half as fast, which isn't bad when you consider that it does half as fast in stable diffusion workloads, which isn't bad considering I don't believe that the matrix cores are being used. So that 190 teraflops is really 90 teraflops, which is about half of what a 4090 is using FP32 accumulate. That's about 170 teraflops. So yeah, when the matrix stuff is added to ROCm for these cards, I think these will be pretty potent compute cards, especially for the money. But how long that will take, when that will come, who knows? Hopefully it comes very soon. But if it doesn't, let's just say I'll be very disappointed. I do hope that AMD gets ROCm into a much, much better place for consumer devices. I know that it was announced that Strix Halo, which we do have in-house, will have ROCm support, which I believe is a great move, but they really do need to get day one support for ROCm on these cards ASAP. Yeah, so I guess that sort of says it all. Yeah, I think that's sort of the end of this video. If you like my ramblings about the RDNA4 architecture and the performance of this thing at 150 watts, as well as me ranting about ROCm, as I always do, give this video a like, give this, subscribe to the Chips and Cheese YouTube channel, and as well as go look at our Substack and all of our stuff that we write on Substack. We will definitely have more in-depth articles about these GPUs, but until then, have a good one, folks.